Charlotte Reed had always lived her life by certain unspoken rules, not the kind printed in law books or posted on signs, but the quiet cultural codes that shaped the world she moved through, codes about decorum, class, who belonged where, and who didn't. These rules were passed down not in words, but in expectations, and Charlotte had learned them early. She followed them without question because they had always worked in her favor. From the moment she stepped into Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, everything followed the script she knew so well. The soft click of her heels on the polished floor, the respectful nods from airport staff as she made her way through priority check-in, the gentle weight of her cashmere coat resting over her shoulders. Even the TSA agent had greeted her with a "Good afternoon, ma'am," that carried a certain reverence. It was the kind of interaction Charlotte didn't just enjoy, she had come to depend on it, like a quiet confirmation of who she was. The first-class boarding lane was nearly empty when she arrived. She liked it that way. Quiet, efficient, elite. She handed over her ticket with a warm but rehearsed smile, her fingers brushing the gold bracelet around her wrist, as if to remind herself, or perhaps the world, that she belonged here, always had, always would. As she stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of leather and citrus cleaner met her senses. First class. Wide seats, champagne on arrival, conversation spoken just above a whisper. This was her world, predictable, polished, protected. But then came row 3. Charlotte paused in the aisle, eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Seated by the window was a man, tall, dark-skinned, wearing a tailored navy suit with the ease of someone used to dressing with precision. He was working intently on a notepad, a pen moving swiftly across the page. There was no flashiness about him, no arrogance, just focus, composure, presence. He didn't look up. Charlotte's first reaction wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was dissonant, a crack in the expectation she didn't know she'd been carrying. It was as though a piece of a puzzle had been forced into the wrong place, and yet it fit, too cleanly to be ignored. She took her seat beside him without a word, placing her structured leather tote under the seat ahead with more force than necessary. She smoothed her skirt, adjusted the scarf at her collar, and stole another glance at the man beside her. He still hadn't acknowledged her. To any outside observer, there was nothing wrong. He wasn't doing anything inappropriate, wasn't loud, wasn't invading her space. If anything, he was more polite than most of the executives she usually sat beside. But something inside Charlotte tightened, quietly, in a place even she wouldn't have been able to name. She shifted in her seat, crossed and uncrossed her legs, glanced back toward the boarding door as though someone might come down the aisle and quietly explain that a mistake had been made, that everything was going back to the way it was supposed to be. But the plane continued to fill. The flight attendants moved through their checks, and Malcolm Hayes, though Charlotte didn't yet know his name, remained exactly where he was, entirely unbothered. It was his stillness that disturbed her the most. There was no trace of nervousness, no awareness of her discomfort. He was not trying to make himself smaller or more accommodating. He simply existed, fully and without apology, in a space Charlotte had long believed was curated for people like her. She didn't understand it, not fully, but she felt it. And somewhere, buried beneath her cultivated poise and social grace, Charlotte began crafting a silent narrative, one that gave her discomfort a shape, a reason, something that allowed her to feel like the victim, not the aggressor. It wasn't racism, not in her mind, not consciously. Charlotte would have rejected the accusation outright. She had worked with black colleagues, donated to inner-city charities, once invited a biracial couple to her home for a holiday dinner. In her world, these gestures were proof enough of her broad-mindedness. But the story she was telling herself now, the subtle, corrosive one, whispered that something was off, that perhaps the airline had made an error, Maybe this man had wandered into the wrong cabin, that she had every right to wonder, every right to ask. The moment stretched. Malcolm turned a page in his notebook, underlining a sentence with calm precision. Charlotte took a breath, steadying her voice before leaning slightly toward him. "Excuse me," she said, her tone soft but edged with pointed curiosity. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" He didn't look at her immediately. He finished the sentence he was writing, closed the notebook, and then turned his head slowly. His gaze met hers. Not confrontational, but clear. Yabui said simply. His voice was calm, almost kind, but there was nothing submissive about it. Charlotte blinked. The word echoed in her mind. No explanation, no apology, just certainty. That single syllable unraveled the quiet authority she had wrapped herself in. She didn't press further, not yet. Instead, she leaned back slightly, lips pressed into a thin line, and turned toward the aisle. She didn't need to say more, because in her world, people like her didn't escalate. They implied, they gestured, they made others do the uncomfortable work of confrontation. And so she caught the eye of a flight attendant, a young woman named Lila, warm-eyed and confident, who was helping another passenger with an overhead bin. Charlotte raised a hand, just slightly, enough to beckon, not to demand. Malcolm didn't move. Lila approached with a gentle smile. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Charlotte gave a soft chuckle, the kind meant to smooth over discomfort with charm. "Oh, I just think there might be a little mix-up," she said lightly, glancing toward Malcolm without turning her head. "I believe this gentleman may be in the wrong seat." Lila looked at Malcolm, then pulled up the seating manifest on her tablet. "Mr. Hayes is in 3A, she said after a moment, her voice polite but firm. "And you're in 3B. Everything looks correct." Charlotte hesitated. "Oh," she said with a small laugh. "Well, I suppose I assumed." The sentence trailed off. Lila smiled again, but it was tighter now. "It happens," she said. "Let me know if you need anything." She moved on. Malcolm reopened his notebook. Charlotte sat still, her composure intact on the surface, but her thoughts racing. She had built her entire life on subtle power, on being able to shift a situation with nothing more than a look, a tone, a suggestion. But now, for reasons she couldn't name, she felt exposed. Because for the first time in a very long time, the rules weren't working. Malcolm Hayes was not intimidated. He was not apologetic. And he was not going anywhere. Charlotte Reed had started this flight believing she knew exactly how the world worked. She was about to learn, very publicly, that the world was changing, and she wasn't ready for it. Charlotte Reed had never been dismissed before, not really. Not in the spaces she occupied, not by the people she encountered. When she asked a question, people responded. When she hinted at a problem, someone stepped in to correct it. It wasn't power in the aggressive sense. It was quieter than that. A life of polished influence, built on expectations that were always met. But this time, something was different. After the flight attendant had confirmed Malcolm Hayes was indeed in the correct seat, Charlotte had offered a forced, apologetic smile, the kind designed to deflect attention, to reset the social equilibrium. But beneath her composed exterior, a subtle panic had begun to spread. She had expected cooperation, not resistance. She had expected validation, not quite correction. And worst of all, he had done nothing. Not once did Malcolm react with defensiveness, not even mild surprise. He had simply looked at her and then returned to his writing, unmoved. And it was that calm, that unshakable stillness, that shook her the most. Now, 10 minutes into the flight, the plane began taxiing toward the runway. The engines rumbled beneath the floor and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, but Charlotte's mind was louder than ever. What am I doing? The question emerged, quiet but persistent. Was she really that disturbed by a man sitting in his rightful seat? Was this about him or was it about her? The internal dialogue should have grounded her, humbled her even, but instead, it sparked something darker. A need to reclaim the power she felt slipping through her fingers. She glanced sideways. Malcolm was still working. No headphones, no phone. Just a leather planner filled with tightly organized notes, a pen moving with efficient rhythm. He had the air of someone who was always prepared, always a step ahead, not arrogant, just quietly confident. Charlotte shifted in her seat, then again. Her movement was subtle, but she made sure it was noticeable enough to be seen by the cabin crew. Her elbow brushed the shared armrest, no reaction. Her knee bounced ever so slightly, as though signaling internal distress. Still nothing. She reached up and pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded above, and moments later, Lila reappeared. The same gentle professionalism, but her expression now carried a quiet caution. "Is everything all right, Miss Reed?" Charlotte kept her voice low, measured. She lowered her eyes and leaned slightly toward Lila, as if sharing something sensitive. "I hate to make a fuss," she began, pausing just long enough to create unease. "But I don't feel entirely comfortable in this seat." Lila's expression didn't shift. She had heard these words before, had seen how they were often wielded like a scalpel, delicate, indirect, and capable of cutting deep without drawing visible blood. "Is there an issue with the seat itself?" Lila asked carefully. Charlotte hesitated, eyes glancing toward Malcolm for just a heartbeat. "No, not the seat. It's more personal. I just prefer a little more space when I travel. I think I'd feel better if I could move." Lila straightened slightly. "Let me check if we have any open seats in first class," she said, tapping gently on her tablet. Charlotte folded her hands in her lap, her fingers interlaced with practiced grace. She didn't look at Malcolm. She didn't need to. Her performance wasn't for him. Lila frowned faintly at her screen. "I'm afraid we're at full capacity in the cabin this afternoon. However, there are a few open seats in economy. I could move you there if you'd like." The word struck Charlotte like a slap. Economy? Her lips parted, but nothing came out at first. Then, a weak chuckle. "Oh, no, I wouldn't be comfortable there either." Lila smiled softly. "In that case, I'll need to ask that you remain in your assigned seat, Ms. Reed." Charlotte nodded stiffly. "Yes, of course." As Lila walked away, Charlotte could feel the shift beginning. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even direct. But it was happening. A couple across the aisle stole a glance in her direction. A man 3 rows ahead lowered his newspaper ever so slightly. And worst of all, Malcolm remained motionless, eyes still on the page, still scribbling in that endless planner as if nothing around him warranted a response. It was infuriating. Charlotte's discomfort deepened, not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't in control. She had triggered something and gotten nothing in return. No apology, no effort to make her feel more comfortable, no verbal cues that she was still the one holding the narrative. She wanted to say it plainly. She wanted to look Lila in the eyes and tell her what she really felt, but she couldn't. Not without risking the very image she'd spent decades building. Instead, she stewed. The silence between them thickened, her breathing shallow, her thoughts spiraling. In her world, being uncomfortable was reason enough. In her world, discomfort justified correction, movement, adjustment. And yet here she was, stuck. She glanced again at Malcolm. This time her eyes lingered longer. Who was he? Why did he sit so comfortably in this space? There were no clues, no tells, no brand logos or luxury watches to explain his presence. And maybe that was the most threatening thing of all. He didn't need permission to be here. He wasn't apologizing for his space. He just took it, without negotiation. She hated how that made her feel. When the drink cart came down the aisle, Charlotte declined her usual champagne. Her mouth was too dry. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been for someone seated in 3B. She clutched the armrest with her left hand and forced herself to look straight ahead. And that's when she made the decision. She couldn't leave it like this, not unresolved, not while everyone was pretending this was normal. Charlotte pressed the call button again. It was a choice made from somewhere deeper than logic, from fear, from pride, from the aching discomfort of being challenged in a world she thought she had mastered. Lila returned more slowly this time. "Ms. Reed," she said, her voice a little more firm. "I need to speak with someone in charge," Charlotte said, her tone now more clipped, more precise. "The head crew member or the pilot, whoever makes decisions on this flight." Lila blinked. "Ma'am, the captain is preparing for takeoff. I'm the lead flight attendant on this route. I'm happy to listen." Charlotte leaned in again, voice even lower than before. "I'm not trying to be difficult, but I don't feel safe." Everything stopped. For a moment, the words just hung there. Not loud, not dramatic, but powerful, calculated. Lila's posture stiffened. A passenger across the aisle looked up. Another adjusted their seatbelt, pretending not to listen. Malcolm didn't move. Charlotte felt the tension tighten in the air like a violin string pulled taut. She had said it. She had played the card. Now, all she had to do was wait for someone to respond. But what she didn't realize, not yet, was that this wasn't the world she thought it was. This wasn't the era where whispers carried unquestioned authority, where discomfort disguised as safety could quietly reshape reality. Malcolm Hayes had been quiet for a reason, but he was listening. And soon, Charlotte Reed would learn that silence, when chosen by the right man, carries more power than she ever imagined. For the first time since boarding, Malcolm Hayes closed his planner. He didn't slam it or sigh or glance accusingly at anyone. He simply set his pen aside, placed his hands on top of the closed leather cover, and looked up, straight at Charlotte. The overhead lights hummed softly. The engines had leveled out, and the seatbelt signs were off. But inside row 3, the atmosphere had shifted into something sharp and brittle, something unspoken that everyone nearby could feel, but no one wanted to name. Lila, the lead flight attendant, remained standing by Charlotte's seat, her posture still professional, but her hands now folded in front of her, a subtle signal that this conversation had become something else entirely. The air around her was different now, measured, alert. Across the aisle, a businessman with a Bluetooth earpiece had stopped pretending to work. He now leaned subtly toward the aisle, listening. 2 rows back, a woman held her phone at chest level, the screen angled ever so slightly forward. Not obviously recording, but not recording either. Charlotte seemed not to notice. "I'm not saying he did anything," she said with practiced restraint, keeping her voice just low enough to imply intimacy, but loud enough to be overheard. "But I don't feel comfortable, and I think that should matter." It was a calculated appeal, not accusatory, not overt, but designed to trigger authority, sympathy, and perhaps a quiet solution. But no one was moving. Not Lila, not Malcolm, not even the passengers, who now watched with thinly veiled curiosity. Charlotte's heart beat faster. Her cheeks flushed. She had expected action, a concession, a return to the rules she knew. Instead, she was silent. Until Malcolm spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and unmistakably in control. "Miss Reed," he said evenly, "would you like to file an official complaint?" Charlotte blinked. The shift was so sudden she didn't understand the words at first. I, "I'm sorry?" she stammered. Malcolm reached into his inner jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small, worn leather case. He flipped it open and held it just high enough for her and everyone around them to see. The gold badge inside gleamed under the cabin lights. It was unmistakable, FBI. Charlotte's entire body stiffened. A low murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone gasped audibly. The woman with the phone reflexively brought it higher. The businessman across the aisle let out a quiet whistle and shook his head. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply looked her in the eye with quiet clarity. "I'm Special Agent Malcolm Hayes," he said, "and since you've implied that you feel unsafe on this flight, I'm obligated to ask, would you like to report a federal concern?" Charlotte's mouth went dry. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had relied on suggestion, on implication, to shift the dynamic. She had never expected the man beside her to possess power of his own, let alone that kind of power. She looked down at the badge again. Her voice caught in her throat. I I didn't mean it that way," she whispered. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, still calm. "Then how did you mean it?" The question wasn't threatening. It wasn't cruel. But it was sharp enough to cut through every performance Charlotte had carefully assembled since the moment she stepped onto the plane. Lila didn't move. She didn't have to. The cabin, just moments ago, filled with low conversation and soft clinks of glassware, had gone quiet. Every word now echoed. "I was just uncomfortable," Charlotte said weakly. "That's all. It's not personal." Malcolm didn't blink. "You pressed the call button twice, asked for me to be removed, then said you didn't feel safe on a commercial flight. That's a serious allegation." Charlotte looked around for backup, but none came. No sympathetic glances, no rescue. Even the man in the blazer who had smirked earlier now looked at her with quiet disgust. Lila finally spoke, her voice even but resolute. "Miss Reed," she said, "Agent Hayes is in his assigned seat. He has done nothing wrong. If you'd like to continue your travel, I'll need confirmation that you can remain in your seat without further incident." Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face flushed a deeper red. She felt every eye on her. And worse, she knew people were recording. It wasn't just about discomfort anymore. It was about proof and consequences. She turned back toward the window, nodding stiffly. "I'm fine," she muttered. "I'll stay." Lila waited for a beat, then gave a single nod and walked away. Malcolm tucked the badge back into his jacket, picked up his pen, and reopened his planner as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. For Charlotte, the flight would no longer be about comfort or convenience. It would be a descent into the consequences of an assumption. And for everyone watching, in person, and soon, online, it would become a story they wouldn't forget. A story of silence broken by the weight of truth. A story that had only just begun. Charlotte Reed had never experienced silence like this. Not the kind that filled libraries or corporate boardrooms. This was a different silence, heavier, denser, charged. It wrapped itself around her like a fog, even as the plane hummed quietly through the sky. She sat stiffly, facing forward, hands folded in her lap, her mind spinning faster than the engines outside the window. The FBI badge was no longer visible, but the memory of it, the unmistakable shimmer of authority and truth, was seared into her mind. So was the sound of Malcolm's voice, calm and unwavering as he offered to take her official statement. And worst of all, the eyes. The eyes were everywhere now. Some passengers tried to pretend they weren't watching, but she could feel it. The turned heads, the subtle gestures, the tension that radiated from their stillness. And Charlotte, for once in her life, wasn't being admired, respected, or envied. She was being watched, with suspicion, with disbelief, with judgment. "That's not who I am," she kept telling herself. "This isn't what I meant." But none of that mattered now. Not in the age of smartphones and real-time outrage. The woman a few rows back, she was still holding her phone at that same quiet angle, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Charlotte caught a glimpse as she shifted in her seat. The caption read, "Racist woman tries to get black man kicked out of first class until he shows his FBI badge." The knot in Charlotte's stomach tightened. She wanted to scream, to snatch the phone away, to explain that it wasn't like that, that this was a misunderstanding, a moment taken out of context. But her throat was dry. Her voice caught somewhere between shame and panic. She reached for her bag with shaking hands and pulled out her phone, as if the screen might somehow offer an escape. The notifications were already beginning. A text from a distant cousin she hadn't heard from in years. A group chat from her women's leadership circle, where her name had suddenly become the topic. One message read simply, "Please tell me this video going around isn't you." She didn't even know what video they meant, but she knew. Of course she knew. The irony was cruel. Charlotte had spent decades cultivating her image. A generous donor, a polished board member, a guest speaker on corporate diversity panels. She had once written an op-ed about unconscious bias in hiring, and now, she was trending. She pulled up Twitter. Her name wasn't just being mentioned, it was climbing, fast. The original video had over 40,000 views and counting. The comments were brutal. She really tried it and failed. Karma, live, and in HD. Entitlement meets reality aspaski and loses. Charlotte's hands trembled, her face flushed hot. She could barely feel the armrest beneath her grip. All she wanted was to land, to disappear, to rewind time. But she was trapped. The flight had at least another hour, and there was nowhere to hide. Beside her, Malcolm hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't looked at her. He was still working, still writing in his notebook, flipping through printed briefing materials like none of this touched him. That made it worse. She needed him to react, to be angry, smug, something. Anything that would justify how she felt, anything that would make her the victim again. But he gave her nothing, and the world gave her no way out. The plane began its slow descent, the captain's voice breaking through the quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be arriving in Washington, D.C. shortly. Please return your seats to their upright positions." Charlotte didn't move. She felt as though the plane wasn't descending. She was, free falling into a life she no longer recognized. The moment the wheels touched the ground, her phone exploded with vibrations. Texts, calls, push alerts, even emails. She didn't answer any of them. But then one name appeared on the screen that made her chest seize. James Rollins, Chair, Marlowe Foundation. She had served on that board for 6 years. A highly visible, nationally respected nonprofit focused on social equity. She had always been praised for her poise, her generosity, her leadership. And now he was calling. Before she could brace herself, she tapped accept. "James," she answered, trying to keep her voice even. There was no greeting on the other end, just his low, composed voice. "Charlotte, we need your resignation, by tonight." She closed her eyes. "Please," she started. "It's already gone viral," he interrupted. "The board voted within the hour. We'll release a statement tomorrow. This is not a conversation." And just like that, the line went dead. Charlotte sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her breath caught in her chest. One moment, one assumption, and now, everything she had spent years building was beginning to unravel, not because of what she didn't say, but because of what she thought she could get away with saying. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she turned slowly toward Malcolm. He didn't meet her gaze. He didn't need to, because the truth had already been spoken, and soon the entire country would be listening. The moment Charlotte Reed stepped off the plane, the air felt heavier, not from the humid D.C. afternoon, but from the weight of what was waiting for her on the other side of the gate. The terminal was buzzing, not chaotic, not yet, but alert, active, aware. A small cluster of people stood near the baggage claim, some holding phones, some whispering. Charlotte tried to avoid their eyes. She hoped, absurdly, that if she walked fast enough and looked determined enough, they might not see her. But of course they had. A young woman in a navy blazer holding a microphone turned toward her, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Wait, that's her," she whispered, not quietly enough. "That's the woman from the video." Charlotte flinched. A camera turned in her direction. Another phone followed. She picked up her pace, the sharp click of her heels bouncing off the tile floor as if each step was its own confession. Miss Reed, Miss Reed, do you have a comment about what happened on the flight? She didn't answer, couldn't. Her face burned with humiliation. She kept walking, past the rental car counters, past the airport cafe where two teenagers whispered behind iced coffees, one of them already typing furiously into their phone. She knew the look, knew the story was still spreading. And then her phone vibrated again. Not just once, but over and over in rapid succession. She tried to ignore it. She had already silenced dozens of calls, declined texts, and ignored voicemails. But one name flashing across the screen made her heart stop cold: Haley Reed, her daughter. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she accepted the call. Mom? Haley's voice was tight, shaken. Is it true? That video? Is that really you? Charlotte tried to speak, but her throat closed. She could barely breathe. Mom, I need you to tell me, Haley pressed. You always said we treat people with respect, that we never judge by appearance, that we stand up for what's right. I didn't mean for this to happen, Charlotte whispered, her voice breaking. It was a misunderstanding. I was just uncomfortable, that's all. No, Mom, Haley cut in, her voice trembling with disappointment. You weren't uncomfortable. You were entitled. And now the whole world sees it. The line went dead. Charlotte stood still in the middle of the terminal, surrounded by noise, motion, people, and yet she felt completely alone. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just about a viral video. It wasn't about embarrassment. It was about who she really was when no one was watching. And now, everyone was. She exited the terminal and stumbled into a waiting taxi. The driver, a middle-aged man with a quiet demeanor, barely acknowledged her. She gave him an address, home, and stared out at the window in silence. On the ride, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. FBI agent confronted by passenger in viral first-class incident speaks out. Her pulse stopped. Malcolm had spoken? She opened the link with trembling hands. A headline. A still photo of his badge mid-air, gleaming under cabin lights. And a quote. I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to be seen for who I am, and not for who she assumed I was. Just one sentence. But it said everything. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, just quiet, unwavering dignity. And in that moment, Charlotte understood something she had spent a lifetime avoiding. People like Malcolm had to carry more than just ID cards and boarding passes. They carried assumptions, projections, threats, the burden of proving they belonged in rooms they had every right to be in. She had spent years thinking herself progressive, open-minded, fair. But fairness wasn't tested in charity events or foundation meetings. It was tested in the quiet moments, like a plane seat next to someone who didn't fit her image of who belonged. By the time she arrived home, the damage was irreversible. The Marlowe Foundation had released a statement. Her inbox was flooded with media requests and resignations from other boards. Her daughter wasn't answering. Her face had become a meme. Her legacy had been reduced to a cautionary tale. She sank into the couch and stared at the floor. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Not to her friends, not to the world, not even to herself. And Malcolm? He had already moved on. By now, he was likely in a conference room or briefing, continuing the work he had always done, protecting people, upholding the law, navigating rooms where he had to earn what others were simply given. He hadn't humiliated her. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded justice. He became justice, in the most quiet, irrefutable way. And that, more than anything, was why the world was listening. Because in the end, this wasn't just about race or class or flying first class. It was about accountability, about how quickly we believe the worst in someone who doesn't fit our comfort zone, about how power shifts, not with volume, but with presence, with dignity that doesn't waver, even under attack. And for Charlotte Reed, it was about learning, too late, that the world no longer rewards the whispers of the privileged. It remembers the silence of the wronged, and it answers with truth. Charlotte Reed's story is not just about a single incident on a flight, it's about the collapse of a carefully crafted identity built on the illusion of moral superiority and unconscious privilege. What began as a seemingly mundane flight from Dallas to Washington, D.C., quickly unraveled into a defining moment, one that exposed the dangerous undercurrents of quiet discrimination and the fragility of reputation in the digital age. Charlotte lived a life of polish and perception. She occupied spaces reserved for the elite, corporate boards, charitable foundations, first-class cabins. To the world, she was a model citizen, generous, articulate, and progressive on paper, but her comfort was built on a silent assumption that her presence was the standard, and those who didn't mirror her image needed to justify theirs. When Malcolm Hayes, a calm, composed black man, sat beside her in first class, that assumption was quietly but profoundly challenged. He didn't violate any rules, he didn't raise his voice, he simply belonged, and that was enough to disrupt Charlotte's unspoken beliefs. Instead of checking her discomfort, she attempted to manipulate the system with a few carefully chosen words, words that carry dangerous weight in a society still grappling with racial bias. "I don't feel safe." But what Charlotte didn't expect was Malcolm's response. He didn't respond with anger. He didn't argue. He simply revealed the truth, with a badge, with presence, with dignity. And in doing so, he exposed not only her prejudice, but her powerlessness when stripped of status and subtle manipulation. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within hours, a video of the incident went viral. The story spread far beyond the walls of the airplane, into living rooms, boardrooms, and newsrooms across the country. Charlotte lost her reputation, her position on a prestigious board, the trust of her peers, and perhaps most painfully, the respect of her own daughter. This wasn't just about being embarrassed, it was about being exposed. Charlotte was forced to face the reality that she had spent a lifetime avoiding, that equality doesn't threaten the deserving, it threatens the entitled. This story is a mirror, one that reflects more than just a single woman's misstep. It asks all of us, what do we assume about the people around us? What quiet biases do we carry into boardrooms, classrooms, conversations, and yes, airplanes? The lesson is clear. True power isn't in volume, it's in presence. Malcolm didn't need to shout to be heard. His restraint was his strength. And Charlotte's undoing wasn't her words, but her unwillingness to examine what fueled them. In a world where accountability can come from any direction, in person or online, we must learn to check our assumptions before we act. Discomfort is not the same as danger, and justice doesn't always wear a uniform, but when it does, we better be sure our conscience can stand next to it. So before you judge someone's place in a room, ask yourself, why does their presence threaten yours? That answer may say more about you than it ever will about them. If this story moved you, made you think, or opened your eyes, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the fuel to keep telling the stories that matter.